June 18th, 1815. 4:30 in the afternoon. The peaceful Belgian village of Plancenoit, population 500, sat on gentle slopes just over a mile southeast of where Napoleon Bonaparte was locked in a desperate struggle against the Duke of Wellington. The villagers had fled the day before, abandoning their homes to armies they knew would turn their streets into a battlefield. At the centre of the village stood the 13th century church of St. Catherine, its white stone walls surrounded by a low defensive wall. Within hours, those walls would be stained red with the blood of thousands. Napoleon had made his gamble. He had split the British and Prussian armies 2 days earlier, defeating Field Marshal Blücher's Prussians at Ligny on June 16th. The 72-year-old Prussian commander had been thrown from his horse in that battle, trampled by French cavalry, and left for dead on the field. Only the quick thinking of his aide-de-camp, who covered Blücher's insignia with a cloak, saved him from capture. Bruised, battered, and reeking of gin and rhubarb ointment that his staff had rubbed into his injuries, Blücher had made a decision that would change the course of history. Against the advice of his chief of staff, August von Gneisenau, who doubted Wellington's ability to stand against Napoleon, Blücher chose not to retreat east toward Prussia. Instead, he would march his army west to Wellington's aid. Napoleon didn't believe it was possible. He had sent Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy with 33,000 men to pursue the Prussians and keep them away from the battlefield. The Emperor was certain that even if some Prussian forces appeared, they would arrive too late and too weak to matter. He was wrong on both counts. At 1 p.m. that afternoon, French observers on Napoleon's right flank reported movement in the distant woods. Dark masses of troops emerging from the Bois de Paris, the forest that lay to the east of the battlefield. Napoleon's staff initially hoped these were Grouchy's forces, finally arriving to support the Emperor. A captured Prussian hussar, brought to Napoleon around 4:30, delivered the devastating news. The troops approaching were not Grouchy. They were General Friedrich Wilhelm von Bülow's 4th Corps, 30,000 strong, and they were headed straight for Plancenoit. The village sat on Napoleon's line of retreat. If the Prussians took Plancenoit, they would be behind the French army, able to cut off the only road back to France. Napoleon's entire force would be surrounded, trapped between Wellington in front and Blücher behind. The Emperor had no choice. He had to hold Plancenoit at all costs. The defence of the village fell initially to Count Georges Mouton de Lobau's 6th Corps, roughly 10,000 men who had been positioned on the heights north of Plancenoit. These were experienced soldiers, but they were spread thin, trying to cover the entire French right flank. When Bülow's advance guard, the 15th Brigade under General Michael von Lostin, came out of the woods, Lobau's troops tried to slow them. French cavalry vedettes, the mounted scouts who formed the first line of defence, retired slowly before the Prussian advance. They were replaced by clouds of French skirmishers who disputed every foot of ground, firing from cover, falling back, firing again. But there were simply too many Prussians. The 15th Brigade had been ordered to secure the village, while the 16th Brigade under Colonel Johann Friedrich Hiller von Geertringen advanced alongside them. These were not Napoleon's elite guard facing them. These were Prussian line infantry and Landwehr, the militia troops that had been called up to fill Prussia's ranks. Many were young, inexperienced men who had never seen battle before. Their uniforms were a mix of regulation and improvised, their equipment sometimes lacking. But they had something the French didn't expect. They had motivation born of years of French occupation, of seeing their country humiliated, of watching Napoleon's armies march through their towns. And they were arriving fresh, while the French had been fighting all day. At approximately 4:30 p.m, the 16th Brigade's 6 battalions formed into line and marched directly on Plancenoit. Their artillery opened fire first, shells crashing into the village streets. Then came the infantry, advancing with their distinctive Prussian precision, drums beating, officers calling the cadence. Lobau's troops, outnumbered and exhausted, fought back from the houses and gardens. The French had fortified the village as best they could in the limited time available. The thick garden walls that surrounded many of the properties gave excellent protection. The narrow streets created natural choke points where a few defenders could hold against many attackers. For a time, the French held. Prussian Jaegers, the light infantry skirmishers, attempted to storm into the village but were quickly driven back by concentrated French musket fire. The distinctive crack of muskets echoed through the streets as both sides blazed away at close range, but the Prussian artillery was methodical and deadly. The gunners had brought their pieces forward, positioning them on the heights overlooking the village, and they poured shot and shell into Plancenoit with professional precision. Buildings began to catch fire. The thatched roofs that covered many of the village homes ignited easily, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. Walls crumbled under the impact of solid shot. And still, the Prussians came forward, battalion after battalion, pressing into the village from the east. Around 5 p.m, the French line finally broke. The 16th Brigade pushed into Plancenoit, driving Lobau's men back through the streets in vicious close quarters fighting. Prussian infantry entered the church grounds, seizing the elevated position around St. Catherine's. From there, they could fire down into the rest of the village and control the main approaches. Lobau's troops fell back to the north, trying to maintain some semblance of a defensive line on the ridges outside the village. They had been pushed out of Plancenoit, and Napoleon's right flank was now completely exposed. News of the village's fall reached Napoleon at his command post. The Emperor was in the middle of orchestrating his attacks against Wellington's centre, trying to break through before more Prussians arrived. He couldn't afford to divert significant forces from that effort, but he also couldn't afford to lose Plancenoit. The solution was to commit just enough force to retake the village and hold it long enough for his main attack to succeed. He turned to Count Philibert Duhem, commander of the Young Guard division. The Young Guard was not the Old Guard, the legendary veterans who formed Napoleon's last tactical reserve. These were younger soldiers, men with several years of service but not the decades of campaigning that marked the true elite. They were still Guard, still better trained and equipped than regular line infantry, still fanatically loyal to the Emperor. Duhem commanded 8 battalions, roughly 4,500 men, organised into 2 brigades of light infantry. These were tirailleurs and voltigeurs, troops trained to skirmish and fight in loose order, men who could think for themselves in the chaos of battle. They were ideal for the kind of confused street fighting that Plancenoit had become. Napoleon's order was simple: take the village, hold it, buy time. The Young Guard formed up in attack columns and marched toward Plancenoit with grim determination. They knew what they were being asked to do. They were walking into a meat grinder, into narrow streets where their numerical advantage would mean nothing, where every house was a fortress and every corner a death trap. But they were the Guard, and the Emperor had given them an order. 3 artillery batteries, 24 guns in total, accompanied them, unlimbering on the heights to provide fire support. As the Young Guard advanced, the French artillery opened up, pouring canister and round shot into the village to suppress the Prussian defenders. Then Duhem's men entered Plancenoit from the west, and the real slaughter began. The fighting that erupted in Plancenoit's streets was unlike anything else on the battlefield that day. This wasn't lines of troops firing volleys at each other from 100 yards away. This was hand-to-hand combat, musket butts and bayonets, men grappling in doorways, firing at point-blank range through windows, fighting room by room through burning buildings. The Prussians had been trying to fortify the church when the Young Guard hit them. Colonel Hiller von Geertringen's men had entered St. Catherine's and were ripping out the wooden benches, using them to create firing platforms behind the churchyard wall and to barricade the entrances. The walls were too high to fire over and too solid to cut loopholes through, so the Prussians improvised, trying to pull down the top of this wall to create firing positions. They didn't have time to finish. The Young Guard tirailleurs came through the village like a storm, firing as they advanced, using their training in skirmishing to move from cover to cover, clearing buildings with practiced efficiency. The Prussian defenders fought back desperately. These were men who knew that losing Plancenoit might mean losing the entire battle. They had marched for hours to get here, had fought their way into this village, and they weren't going to give it up easily. Musket fire rattled through the streets at ranges measured in feet, not yards. Men fell everywhere, shot down in doorways, bayoneted in gardens, crushed under collapsing walls. The narrow streets ran with blood. The wounded cried out from where they had fallen, often to be bayoneted by advancing troops from either side. Neither side was taking many prisoners. The battle had reached a level of savagery that shocked even veterans, and through it all, the village burned. Flames spread from building to building, fed by wooden structures dried by the summer sun. The smoke was so thick that soldiers often couldn't see more than a few yards. They fired at muzzle flashes in the smoke, at shadows, at sounds. The roar of musketry was continuous, a sound like tearing canvas magnified 1,000 times. The young guard pushed forward with fanatical determination. They knew their orders: take the village, hold it. They fought their way to the church, clearing the streets leading to St. Catherine's with bayonet charges that drove the Prussians back step by bloody step. The fight for the churchyard was particularly vicious. The Prussians had created defensive positions there, using the low wall and the elevated ground to their advantage. The young guard tirailleurs had to assault uphill into prepared positions under fire every step of the way. They did it anyway. Companies of young guard infantry charged the churchyard in succession, each wave getting a little further before being shot down, the next wave stepping over the bodies of their comrades to press the attack. After what eyewitnesses described as a frightful struggle, the young guard retook the church. The Prussians were forced out of the churchyard, out of the church itself, pushed back through the village streets. By approximately 6 p.m, the young guard had recaptured most of Plancenoit. They set up defensive positions throughout the village, occupying the buildings, fortifying what they could, preparing for the counterattack they knew was coming. General Duhesme rode through the streets on horseback, directing his troops, encouraging them, exposing himself to fire with the casual disregard for danger that marked guard officers. He didn't have long to savour the victory. The Prussians were reorganising for another assault, and this time they were coming with everything they had. General von Bülow had been reinforced. The 14th Brigade under General Hans von Rissel had arrived, adding another 7,000 men to the Prussian force. Elements of General Georg von Perch's 2nd Corps were also beginning to appear, thousands more troops streaming out of the woods toward Plancenoit. The Prussians now had over 30,000 men converging on the village. The young guard, even with Lobau survivors, numbered perhaps 15,000. The mathematics were brutal and simple. The Prussians could afford to trade casualties, the French could not. Around 6:30 p.m, the Prussians attacked again. This time the assault was coordinated and massive. The 14th Brigade led the way with the reformed 16th Brigade coming up in reserve. Prussian artillery hammered the village again, setting more buildings ablaze, collapsing walls onto the defenders sheltering behind them. Then came the infantry, battalion after battalion, advancing through the smoke and flames with determination born of desperation. They knew Wellington was holding on by his fingernails a mile away. They knew that every minute they kept French troops tied down at Plancenoit was a minute Wellington didn't face those troops. The 14th Brigade pushed into the eastern edge of the village again. The young guard met them with volley fire and bayonet charges, but there were just too many Prussians. The defenders were pushed back house by house, street by street. The fighting reached the churchyard again. The Prussians stormed the elevated position around St. Catherine's in a fury of bayonet charges and point-blank musketry. The young guard tirailleurs fought back with everything they had, but they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Inside the church, wounded from both sides, lay on the stone floor, many dying, all suffering. The building itself was starting to burn. Flames from the surrounding structures had spread to St. Catherine's roof. The interior of the church became a vision of hell, lit by flickering firelight that played across the faces of the dead and dying, the screams of the wounded echoing off the stone walls. A Prussian general, von Perch, would later describe the scene. The waves of light from the billowing flames which crossed the windows enlightened the dead and the disfigured features of the wounded and dying who crowded the sacred edifice. It was a spectacle more savage and terrible than anything he had seen in years of warfare. The young guard were being pushed back throughout the village. They fought with desperation, knowing that losing Plancenoit meant disaster, but they were exhausted, their ammunition running low, their ranks thinned by casualties. General Duhesme was hit in the head by a musket ball while urging his men forward. The wound was serious, potentially fatal, but he refused to leave the field. His officers had to support him on his horse, holding him upright while he continued to direct the defence. It wasn't enough. By 7 p.m, the Prussians had retaken most of Plancenoit. The young guard had been slowly evicted after what was described as vicious, bloody and bitter street fighting. The wounded on both sides were often bayoneted rather than captured, the fighting too intense and desperate for quarter to be given. The loss of Plancenoit for the second time threatened catastrophe. Napoleon had been preparing to commit his last reserves, the remaining battalions of the Imperial Guard, to make one final thrust at Wellington's centre. But he couldn't do that with 30,000 Prussians behind his lines, threatening his entire army. He made a decision that would seal the fate of the battle. He would send part of the Old Guard to retake Plancenoit one more time. The rest would assault Wellington. It was the ultimate gamble. If either attack failed, the battle was lost. Napoleon selected 2.5 battalions from his precious Old Guard. These were not the young guard, not inexperienced soldiers with a few years' service. These were the immortals, as the French army called them. Veterans with an average age of 35, men who had been soldiering for 15 years, who had marched from Moscow to Madrid, who had never known defeat. The 1st Battalion of the 2nd Chasseurs would lead the charge. The 1st Battalion of the 2nd Grenadiers would follow, along with 2 companies from the 2nd Battalion of 1st Grenadiers, in total about 1,500 men. Major General Pellet would lead them. These men were hard as iron. They had been selected for the Old Guard based on height. They were all tall men, physically imposing and on combat record. They had won their positions through years of fighting, and they received higher pay, better equipment, and the undying respect of every soldier in the French army. They were lean, tough men, tested by marches and deprivation and endless campaigning. When they moved with the confidence of men who had never been beaten. Napoleon's orders were specific. Retake Plancenoit, drive the Prussians out, hold it long enough for the final attack to succeed. The 2.5 battalions of Old Guard formed up. They fixed bayonets, and then they marched toward the burning village with the calm, professional air of men going to work. What happened next became legendary in both armies. The Old Guard didn't advance with drums beating and flags flying. They marched in attack columns, tight formations that maximised their shock power in close quarters. As they approached the eastern edge of Plancenoit, they broke into a charge, and they did something that shocked every witness. They recaptured the village without firing a shot. The Old Guard went through Plancenoit with the bayonet alone, charging with a ferocity that broke the Prussian defenders' will to resist. These Prussian troops were not cowards. They had been fighting for hours in the most horrific conditions imaginable. They had retaken this village twice, had suffered appalling casualties doing it, and they were exhausted. But when the Old Guard came at them with cold steel, when 1,500 of Napoleon's best troops charged into the burning, streets with bayonets levelled and that terrible silence that meant they weren't stopping for anything, the Prussians broke. The Old Guard pushed through the village mercilessly, bayoneting everything in their path. Prussian soldiers who tried to stand were cut down. Those who tried to run were chased down and killed. The remnants of the young guard, rallied by the appearance of their elite comrades, joined the charge. Together, they drove completely through Plancenoit, clearing every street, every house, every garden. The Prussians were thrown out of the village in disorder, fleeing back toward the woods they had emerged from hours earlier. The Old Guard captured the church again, secured the churchyard, and set up defensive positions throughout Plancenoit. The village, now almost completely carpeted with bodies, was back in French hands. It was approximately 7:15 p.m. The Old Guard had accomplished their mission in less than 15 minutes. The sheer shock of their assault, the reputation that preceded them, the veteran skill with which they had executed the attack, all of it combined to break Prussian resistance that had held against everything else the French threw at them. But here's the thing about the Old Guard's success. It didn't matter. There were too many Prussians, and more were arriving with every passing minute. General von Bülow had seen the Old Guard retake the village, and he knew what it meant. Napoleon had committed his last reserves. The Emperor had nothing left. Bülow ordered his commanders to prepare another assault, the largest yet. He now had elements of 4 brigades available, the 13th, 14th, 15th and 16th, plus the arriving troops from Second Corps. Over 30,000 men were being assembled for the next attack on Plancenoit. The Old Guard in the village numbered perhaps 3,000, counting the rallied young guard and Lobau's survivors. The odds were 10 to 1. It didn't take a military genius to know how that was going to end. At approximately 7:30 p.m, as the sun began to set over the battlefield, the Prussians attacked Plancenoit for the final time, and this time it wasn't just infantry. Prussian artillery had been brought forward, dozens of guns positioned on every side of the village, and they opened fire simultaneously. The bombardment was crushing. Buildings that had somehow survived earlier collapsed under the impact. The fires spread, fed by the artillery. The smoke became so thick that defenders couldn't see attackers until they were right on top of them. And through that smoke and fire came the Prussian infantry, more of them than had attacked before, battalion after battalion emerging from the darkness, advancing with the grim determination of men who knew they had to win. The Old Guard met them with volley fire this time, standing in the streets and gardens, firing organised volleys into the advancing Prussians at murderously close range. Men fell in rows, cut down by the precise fire of veteran soldiers who had drilled together for years. But for every Prussian who fell, 2 more took his place. The attackers pressed forward, absorbing casualties that would have broken lesser troops, pushing into the village from every direction. The 13th Brigade under General Albrecht von Hacke came in from the north, hitting Lobau's positions on the ridges and driving them back into the village. The 14th and 16th Brigades attacked from the east, the main assault, thousands of men advancing through the smoke and flames. The 15th Brigade, which had started this entire battle, came in from the south, completing the encirclement. The Old Guard were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. But they were the Old Guard, and they didn't run. The fighting that followed was the bloodiest of the entire day. Both sides fought with a fury born of desperation. The Prussians knew that every minute counted, that Wellington was under terrible pressure and needed this diversion. The French knew that losing Plancenoit meant losing the battle, meant the end of the empire, meant the end of everything they had fought for across a dozen years. They fought for every house, every street, every inch of ground. The casualties were appalling. The 18th Prussian Infantry Regiment, which had been formed just months earlier from reserve battalions, suffered over 700 casualties in the fighting for Plancenoit. The 1st Tirailleurs of the Young Guard lost 92% of their strength, virtually annihilated. 2/3 of Lobau's 6th Corps were casualties. The numbers were staggering, but they don't capture the reality of what was happening in those streets. Men fought hand-to-hand in burning buildings. Soldiers were buried alive when walls collapsed on them. The wounded died in the flames, unable to escape. The smoke was so thick that men were bayoneting their own comrades by mistake, and through it all, the Old Guard held. They made their last stand in the churchyard of St. Catherine. The stone wall, battered by artillery, pockmarked by musket balls, still provided some protection. The elevated ground gave them a commanding position, and the Old Guard, what was left of them, formed square behind that wall and prepared to die like soldiers. The Prussians came at them from every direction, waves of infantry attacking uphill, taking terrible casualties from the Guard's disciplined volleys, falling back, reforming, attacking again. Officers on both sides showed incredible bravery. Lieutenants led charges knowing they wouldn't survive. Sergeants rallied broken companies and led them back into the inferno. Common soldiers performed acts of heroism that would never be recorded, fighting and dying in the smoke and flames for causes they barely understood. Lieutenant M. Louis of the 3rd Tirailleurs, born at Jodoigne, fell in the churchyard at age 28. Lieutenant Jacques Tatet of the Old Guard Artillery, member of the Legion of Honour, was killed at the start of the battle, aged 22. They were 2 of thousands who died in Plancenoit that evening, names that would be forgotten by history except for memorial plaques placed years later. By 8 p.m, it was over. The sheer weight of numbers finally overwhelmed the French defenders. The Old Guard, or what remained of them, were forced back from the churchyard. The Prussians broke into the burning church, fighting room to room, floor by floor. The last French defenders, surrounded and out of ammunition, finally surrendered or fled into the darkness. Plancenoit had changed hands for the 5th and final time that day. The village was a ruin. Virtually every building was damaged or destroyed. The streets were choked with bodies, French and Prussian mixed together in death. The wounded lay everywhere, crying out for water, for help, for death to end their suffering. The church of St. Catherine was a burned-out shell, its interior filled with corpses. The cost had been horrific. Each side had suffered approximately 6,000 casualties in the fighting for this one small village. That was more than the entire Prussian army lost at some battles, more than many nations fielded in total, and it had all happened in less than 4 hours, in an area measuring perhaps 500 yards across. But the sacrifice had served its purpose. While the Prussians were tied down at Plancenoit, bleeding themselves against the French defenders, Wellington had held on. Napoleon's final attack with the middle guard against the British centre had been thrown back with devastating losses. The cry had gone up along the French lines. "La garde recule, the guard retreats." It was something the French army had never seen. The Imperial Guard retreating. And once that happened, once the myth of invincibility was shattered, the French army came apart. Units that had fought all day with stubborn courage suddenly broke and ran. The retreat became a rout, and the Prussians, emerging from the smoking ruins of Plancenoit, were perfectly positioned to cut off that retreat. Prussian cavalry, fresh troops who hadn't been ground down in the street fighting, pursued the fleeing French with merciless efficiency. They gave no quarter, sabre down anyone they caught, turned an organised retreat into a panicked mob. Napoleon's carriage was captured by Prussian cavalry at Gamapa, along with his personal belongings, his treasure, even his famous bicorn hat. The Emperor himself barely escaped, protected by the squares of the remaining Old Guard, who formed a rear guard and retreated in good order even as the rest of the army disintegrated around them. By midnight, the French army had ceased to exist as an organised force. Over 25,000 French casualties, thousands more captured, the artillery abandoned, the supply trains lost. It was the end of Napoleon's 100 days, the end of the empire, the end of an era. And it had all hinged on a small Belgian village that most of Europe had never heard of. What made Plancenoit remarkable wasn't just the fighting, though. That was extraordinary enough. It was who did the fighting. On the French side, yes, the Old Guard were elite troops, the best soldiers in Napoleon's army. But the young guard who bore the brunt of the battle were younger, less experienced. And on the Prussian side, many of the troops who took and retook that village were not regulars. They were Landwehr, militia, men who had been civilians a few years earlier. The 18th Infantry Regiment that suffered so terribly was formed from reserve battalions, soldiers who had never fought a major battle before. These were not supposed to be the troops who could stand up to Napoleon's guard, but they did. They took Plancenoit. They lost it. They took it again. They were driven out by the Old Guard's bayonet charge, one of the most fearsome tactical moves in military history, and then they came back and took it a final time, fighting against troops who had conquered Europe, and they won. What does that tell us? It tells us that by 1815, something fundamental had changed in European warfare. The old certainties that veteran troops would always beat inexperienced ones, that elite units were invincible, that French soldiers under Napoleon couldn't be beaten, all of those certainties were being challenged. The Prussian army that fought at Waterloo was not the Prussian army that Napoleon had crushed at Jena in 1806. That army had been destroyed, humiliated, scattered, but Prussia had reformed, had rebuilt, had learned. They had studied French tactics and adopted what worked. They had reformed their training, their organisation, their entire military system, and they had motivated their soldiers with something more powerful than pay or glory. They had given them a cause. These men were fighting to liberate their country from foreign occupation, to avenge years of humiliation, to prove that Prussia could stand against France. That motivation, combined with competent leadership and decent training, was enough to make even inexperienced troops dangerous. The Prussian Musketeers and Landwehr who fought at Plancenoit weren't as skilled as the Old Guard. They weren't as well drilled or equipped. But they kept coming. They absorbed horrific casualties and kept attacking. They were driven out of the village 3 times and came back a 4th. That kind of determination, that refusal to accept defeat, was something that no amount of veteran status could overcome. The French Guard were brave, skilled, experienced, but they were fighting for an empire that was already lost, for a cause that most of Europe had turned against, for an emperor who had led them to disaster in Russia and dragged them into endless wars. The Prussians were fighting for their homes. In the end, that made all the difference. There's a memorial in Plancenoit today, a small marker placed near where the Prussian memorial stands. It reads, "In this village of Plancenoit that became famous on 18th of June 1815, the young guard of the Emperor Napoleon distinguished itself. It was commanded by General Count Duhesme, who was fatally wounded. Duhesme died of his wounds 2 days after the battle, at Genappe, finally succumbing to the head wound he had refused to leave the field for. Inside the rebuilt church of St. Catherine, there's another plaque to Lieutenant Tatet of the Old Guard Artillery, killed at age 22. These small memorials mark a battle that most people have never heard of, fought in a village that played no role in history before or after that one day. But Plancenoit mattered. it mattered more than most battles that fill the history books. Because while the story of Waterloo is usually told as Wellington's victory, as the British Guards defeating the Imperial Guard on the ridge, the reality is more complex. Wellington held his position by his fingernails, barely hanging on, taking terrible casualties, watching his line bend and crack but never quite break. He held because he knew the Prussians were coming, and the Prussians came. They marched from Wavre over muddy roads, exhausted from their defeat at Ligny, led by a 72-year-old field marshal who could barely sit on his horse from his injuries. They came because Blucher had given his word to Wellington, and because they saw a chance to destroy Napoleon once and for all. When they arrived at Plancenoit, they didn't just attack. They committed everything. They threw brigade after brigade into that meat grinder, accepting casualties that would have broken other armies, because they understood what was at stake, and they won. Not through superior skill or tactics or equipment. They won through sheer bloody-minded determination, through the willingness to take losses that the French couldn't afford, through the ability to keep feeding fresh troops into a battle that had become an abattoir. By 8 p.m. on June 18, 1815, when the Prussians finally secured Plancenoit for the last time, Napoleon had nothing left. His young guard was shattered. Part of his old guard was tied down in the village ruins. The rest had been thrown back from Wellington's Ridge with terrible losses. His army was beginning to break apart, and 30,000 Prussians were in his rear, cutting his line of retreat. The battle was over. The Empire was over. 23 years of nearly continuous warfare, from the French Revolution through the Napoleonic Wars, all of it ending in the burning ruins of a Belgian village most people couldn't find on a map. The Prussian Musketeers and Landwehr who fought at Plancenoit weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They weren't knights in shining armour. They were ordinary men, farmers and shopkeepers and labourers who'd been given uniforms and muskets and told to march. Many of them were terrified. Some of them broke and ran when the old guard came at them with bayonets, but enough of them stood. Enough of them kept fighting. Enough of them came back after being driven out, again and again, until finally they won. In the grand sweep of history, Plancenoit is a footnote. The Battle of Waterloo is remembered. Napoleon's final defeat is remembered. But the 5 separate battles for one small village, the 12,000 casualties suffered by both sides in 4 hours of fighting, the incredible courage showed by troops on both sides, all of that tends to get lost in the larger story. But it shouldn't be lost. Because Plancenoit was where the battle was really won. Wellington's Ridge was where Napoleon was stopped, but Plancenoit was where he was destroyed. The men who fought there, French and Prussian alike, showed extraordinary bravery under conditions that beggar description. They fought in burning buildings, in smoke so thick they couldn't see, at ranges so close they could see their enemies' faces before they killed them. They fought until their ammunition ran out, then fought with bayonets. They fought until they were wounded, then fought on. Some of them fought until they died, unwilling to retreat, unable to accept defeat. The French Guard made their last stand in that churchyard, knowing they were going to lose, knowing the battle was lost, knowing the Empire was ending, and they stood anyway, because they were the Guard, and that's what the Guard did. The Prussian infantry came back a 4th time, attacking troops who had never been beaten, advancing into fire that cut down men in rows, climbing over the bodies of their friends to get at the enemy. Because they had marched all day to get here, and they weren't going to let Napoleon escape now. In the end, both sides lost. The French lost the battle, the Empire, everything they had fought for. The Prussians won the battle but paid for it with rivers of blood. The real victors were the politicians in Vienna who would redraw the map of Europe, the monarchs who would be restored to thrones, the systems and structures that would define Europe for the next century. The soldiers who did the actual fighting got graves, if they were lucky. Mass graves mostly, unmarked plots where the bodies were thrown in by the hundreds and buried under thin layers of soil. Some of them didn't even get that. In the days after the battle, locals robbed the dead, stripping bodies of anything valuable. Teeth were pulled to make dentures, a gruesome trade that supplied dentists across Europe with what were euphemistically called Waterloo teeth. The wounded who couldn't walk were often left to die where they fell. There weren't enough doctors, enough supplies, enough care to save them all. Some of them survived by crawling to safety, dragging themselves through the mud and blood, taking days to reach aid. The village of Plancenoit was rebuilt, slowly, over years. The Church of St. Catherine was reconstructed, though it wasn't completed until 1857. The scars of the battle faded. The blood soaked into the soil and was forgotten. The bodies decomposed and disappeared. Within a generation, most people had forgotten that Plancenoit had even been fought over. It was just another village, unremarkable, peaceful, home to farmers and workers who went about their lives without knowing or caring that their homes stood on ground where thousands had died. But the battle mattered. It changed the course of European history. It ended Napoleon's career and with it the French domination of Europe. It established Britain as the dominant European power for the next century. It reshaped the German states and set in motion processes that would eventually lead to German unification. It showed that citizen soldiers, motivated and competently led, could stand against professional armies. It proved that the age of the old guard, the elite veteran troops who had ruled European battlefields for a generation, was ending. The future belonged to mass armies of ordinary men, fighting for causes they believe in. The Prussian Musketeers who surprised Napoleon's elite guard at Plancenoit weren't superhuman. They were just men. They were scared, tired, often badly led, sometimes poorly equipped. But they had one advantage that the old guard didn't have in that moment. They had a reason to win that was stronger than training or experience or reputation. They were fighting to liberate their country. They were fighting to end years of occupation and humiliation. They were fighting to prove that Prussia still mattered, that they weren't a defeated people, that they could stand against the conqueror of Europe and win. That motivation, that cause, gave them the strength to do the impossible, to attack into fire that should have broken them, to come back after being driven out, to keep fighting when any rational person would have run, to stand against the old guard and refuse to break. And in the end, that was enough. Not enough to make them better soldiers than the guard, but enough to make them win anyway. That's the real lesson of Plancenoit. It's not about tactics or training or equipment, though those things matter. It's about why men fight, and what they're willing to endure for a cause they believe in. The old guard were mercenaries in the end, professional soldiers fighting for pay and glory and habit. They were brave and skilled and experienced, but they were fighting for an empire that was already lost. The Prussian musketeers were fighting for their homes, and that made them willing to pay any price, accept any casualties, endure any horror to win. And so they won, not because they were better soldiers, but because they wanted it more. The aftermath of Plancenoit revealed truths that neither side wanted to acknowledge. When Prussian burial details entered the village on June 19th, they found scenes that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Corporal Friedrich Lindau of the 2nd Westphalian Landwehr Regiment recorded in his diary what he saw. The streets were not paved with cobblestones anymore, but with bodies. You could walk from one end of Plancenoit to the other, without your boots touching ground, stepping only on the dead. French and Prussian mixed together, sometimes locked in final embraces where they had bayoneted each other simultaneously. The smell was already unbearable in the June heat. The wounded who had survived the night were delirious with thirst and pain, calling out for water that no one could provide because the wells were choked with debris and contaminated with blood. The Church of St. Catherine had become a charnel house. The interior was filled with bodies stacked 3 deep in places. The wounded had crawled there seeking sanctuary, only to be trapped when the building caught fire. Many had burned to death, their bodies contorted into shapes that defied description. Others had suffocated from the smoke. The Prussian soldiers tasked with clearing the church had to be rotated out after 15 minutes, because they couldn't endure it longer. Several vomited uncontrollably. One young Landwehr soldier, barely 18 years old, went mad on the spot and had to be restrained. He kept screaming that he could hear them calling for help, even though everyone inside was long dead. He was sent to the rear and never returned to duty. The psychological toll of Plancenoit extended far beyond those who died there. Lieutenant Karl von Rettberg of the 15th Brigade wrote to his sister 3 weeks after the battle, "I cannot close my eyes without seeing Plancenoit, the flames, the smoke, the faces of men as they died. We were told it was a great victory. We liberated Belgium. We saved Europe from tyranny. But when I think of the price, the boys from Pomerania and Brandenburg who will never go home, I wonder if any victory is worth such cost. I killed men at Plancenoit. I know I did. I fired my pistol at ranges where I could see their eyes. I ran one through with my sword when he tried to surrender, because there was no time for prisoners. I am told I should be proud. I am told I did my duty. I feel only sick. The French survivors of Plancenoit scattered with the rest of Napoleon's army. Many of the old guard who escaped the village formed the rearguard that allowed Napoleon himself to flee. They retreated in squares, maintaining discipline even as the army around them disintegrated into a mob. Prussian cavalry charged those squares repeatedly throughout the night, trying to break them, trying to capture Napoleon. Every charge was thrown back with volleys that emptied saddles and sent horses crashing to the ground. The old guard retreated 20 miles that night, fighting every step of the way until they finally reached French territory and relative safety. Of the 1,500 men who had charged into Plancenoit, fewer than 400 made it back to France. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. Captain Jean-Baptiste Lemonnier de la Fosse of the 1st Grenadiers of the Old Guard wrote his account years later. He had been in the churchyard when the final Prussian assault came. We knew it was the end. We could hear them coming from every direction. Thousands of them. Their officers calling out orders in German, their drums beating that distinctive Prussian cadence. Our ammunition was nearly exhausted. We had perhaps 10 rounds per man left. The colonel called us together. He was wounded, blood streaming down his face from a scalp wound, but he stood straight and spoke calmly. "Grenadiers," he said, "we are the Guard. We have never surrendered. We will not begin today. When the ammunition is gone, we use the bayonet. When the bayonet breaks, we use our fists. We fight until we cannot fight any more. Then, if we must die, we die as soldiers of France." We gave them 3 volleys, perfect volleys, as precise as if we were on parade. Men fell in rows before us, but they kept coming. Then our ammunition was gone and we fixed bayonets. What followed was butchery. They came at us like waves against a cliff, crashing into our square, being thrown back, coming again. We stabbed and clubbed and fought like madmen. The square grew smaller as men fell. We stepped over our own wounded to close the ranks. I saw Sergeant Dumont, who had been with the Guard for 19 years, who had marched to Moscow and back, take 3 bayonets at once and still kill the man in front of him before he died. I saw Lieutenant Moreau lose his arm to a sabre cut and pick up a musket with his remaining hand to use as a club. I saw acts of courage that would fill a dozen books, performed by men whose names no one will remember. Finally, there were too few of us left to maintain the square. It collapsed into a melee, every man for himself. I fought my way clear with 6 or 7 others. We ran through the burning village, Prussians chasing us, firing at our backs. 2 of my companions fell. The rest of us made it to the darkness beyond the village and kept running. We didn't stop until dawn. Of my company, 87 men who entered Plancenoit, 9 survived uninjured. The Guard had done its duty. We had bought the Emperor time for his attack on Wellington, but the attack had failed, and we had sacrificed ourselves for nothing. The Prussian commanders initially celebrated their victory at Plancenoit as proof of their army's resurgence. Field Marshal Blucher, still recovering from his injuries at Ligny, rode into the village 2 days after the battle. He was shown the positions where the Old Guard had made their stands, told of the 5 separate battles for control of the streets, briefed on the casualty figures. 6,000 Prussian casualties for one village. Blucher, who had seen action in dozens of battles over a 40-year career, was reportedly shaken. "So many," he said quietly. "So many of my boys. Was it necessary?" His chief of staff, Gneisenau, responded firmly. "Without Plancenoit, Wellington falls. Without Wellington falling, Napoleon escapes to fight another day. Every man who died here saved 10 more at the ridge. It was necessary." Blucher was not consoled. He requested that a memorial be erected to honour the Prussian dead, but also insisted it acknowledge the courage of their French opponents. "The brave do not cease to be brave because they fight for the wrong side," he said. The tactical innovations that emerged from Plancenoit would influence military doctrine for decades. The Prussian General Staff studied the battle extensively, trying to understand how their troops had succeeded where others might have failed. Several factors were identified. First, the Prussian artillery had been employed aggressively, brought forward to positions where it could fire directly into the village at close range. This was dangerous, exposing the guns to capture, but it provided devastating support to the infantry attacks. Second, the Prussian infantry had attacked in mixed formations, combining line troops with Landwehr, regulars with militia. This meant that when one unit was exhausted, fresh troops could take over the assault without requiring a complete withdrawal and reorganization. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the Prussian commanders had accepted casualties that would have been considered unacceptable under earlier doctrines. Captain Karl von Clausewitz, who would later become famous for his military theory, was serving on the Prussian General Staff and analysed the Plancenoit fighting. His conclusions, published years later, emphasised what he called the moral element in warfare. The Prussian troops at Plancenoit, he wrote, were not superior to the French Guard in training or equipment. They were inferior in most measurable ways, but they possessed a moral advantage that proved decisive. They were fighting a defensive war, protecting their homeland from an aggressor. This gave them a strength of will that allowed them to absorb punishment that would have broken troops fighting for less compelling reasons. The lesson, Clausewitz argued, was that the moral factors in war, the why of fighting, were often more important than the how. This analysis would influence Prussian and later German military thinking for generations. The idea that motivated citizen soldiers could defeat professional armies became central to Prussian doctrine. It justified the expansion of the Landwehr system, the creation of reserve forces, the concept of the nation in arms. By 1870, when Prussia went to war with France again, the Prussian army was built on the foundation of the lessons learned at Plancenoit. Trained reserves, citizens who had served their time in the military and returned to civilian life but could be recalled in emergency, backed up the professional army. This system allowed Prussia to field armies of unprecedented size while maintaining high training standards, and it worked. The French army of 1870, still relying heavily on long-service professionals, was crushed by Prussian forces that included large numbers of reservists and Landwehr. The French drew different conclusions from Plancenoit. The performance of the young guard, which had held the village, twice before being overwhelmed, was seen as proof that France needed more guard units, more elite troops. This was exactly the wrong lesson. The problem at Waterloo wasn't that France lacked elite troops. It was that Napoleon had spent his elite troops recklessly, committing them to attacks that had little chance of success, wearing them down in battles like Plancenoit when they should have been held as a decisive reserve. But the French military establishment, dominated by men who had served in the Grande Armée, couldn't accept that conclusion. To them, the Guard had performed magnificently at Plancenoit. The problem was that there hadn't been enough of them. If Napoleon had committed 4 battalions instead of 2, if he had sent the entire old Guard into the village, surely they would have held it indefinitely. This flawed analysis led France to maintain a military system focused on elite units and long-service professionals throughout the 19th century. While Prussia was developing the nation in arms concept, France was creating more guard regiments, more elite formations, more professional soldiers. The result was that by 1870, France could field an army of perhaps 400,000 men, all professionals, all well-trained. Prussia could field over 1 million, mixing professionals with trained reserves and Landwehr. The size difference was decisive. The lessons of Plancenoit, misread by the French, properly understood by the Prussians, shaped the military balance of power in Europe for 2 generations. On the ground at Plancenoit itself, the healing was slow and painful. The village had to be almost entirely rebuilt. Most of the buildings were damaged beyond repair, their walls cracked by artillery fire, their roofs burned away, their interiors destroyed. The reconstruction took years and was funded partly by the Prussian government and partly by contributions from across Europe. The Church of St. Catherine was not completed until 1857, 42 years after the battle. During those 4 decades, the ruins stood as a reminder of what had happened there. Children played among the broken walls, unaware that they were climbing over mass graves. Farmers ploughed fields around the village and regularly turned up bones, uniform buttons, musket balls, fragments of equipment. For years after the battle, the soil around Plancenoit had a reddish tinge from the blood that had soaked into it. The psychological impact on survivors extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. Captain Wilhelm von Scharnhorst of the 14th Brigade returned to Prussia after the war and tried to resume his civilian career as a lawyer. He couldn't do it. He wrote to a friend in 1817, "I sit in my office and clients talk to me about property disputes and contract law, and all I can think about is Plancenoit. The smell of burning flesh, the sound of men screaming as they burned alive in the church, the faces of boys, 18 and 19 years old, who looked at me with trust as I led them into that inferno, and who died there because I gave the orders. I am told I should be proud. I am told we saved Europe, but I traded the lives of those boys for a continent, and I am not certain the exchange was worth it. Many veterans of Plancenoit struggled with what we would now recognise as post-traumatic stress disorder. The nightmares, the inability to adjust to civilian life, the drinking problems, the sudden rages, all of it was common among those who had fought in the village. The Prussian army had no system for dealing with psychological casualties. Men were expected to endure, to be strong, to move on with their lives. Those who couldn't were often dismissed as weak or cowardly, even if they had proven their courage under fire. Some committed suicide, others drank themselves to death. A few found peace in religious devotion, entering monasteries or becoming priests, seeking in faith what they couldn't find in civilian life. The tactical details of the Plancenoit fighting became the subject of intense study at military academies across Europe. The village's layout, the narrow streets, the defensible buildings, the elevated position of the church, all of it was analysed and discussed. Models were built, tabletop exercises conducted, officer candidates were asked to solve the problem of how to take or hold Plancenoit with various force ratios. The consensus that emerged was that the village should never have been held by the French at all. The correct tactical decision would have been to defend the heights north of Plancenoit and allow the Prussians to occupy the village itself. From the heights, French artillery could have pounded the village into rubble without exposing infantry to the meat grinder of street fighting. The Prussian advance would have been slowed just as effectively without the horrific casualties. But Napoleon hadn't made the correct tactical decision. He had made a decision based on psychology and symbolism. Losing Plancenoit, even temporarily, would have been a visible sign of weakness, a signal to his army that the Prussians were winning. By fighting for every inch of the village, by committing the guard to retake it, Napoleon had sent a message that the French were still in the fight, that they would hold every position, that defeat was not an option. It was a strategic error based on sound psychological reasoning, and it cost him the battle. The troops tied down at Plancenoit, particularly the battalions of Old Guard that spent critical hours fighting there, were unavailable for the final attack on Wellington. If those 2.5 battalions had been with the rest of the Guard when it attacked the British Ridge, the outcome might have been different. The British historians who wrote the early accounts of Waterloo largely ignored Plancenoit. Their focus was on Wellington's defensive stand, on the British Guards meeting the Imperial Guard, on the famous order to stand up guards and give them a volley. Plancenoit was mentioned, if at all, as a sideshow, a secondary action that had little impact on the main battle. This interpretation infuriated Prussian veterans. They knew the truth. They had been there. They had bled for hours in that village while Wellington's line wavered and bent and nearly broke. They had tied down a substantial portion of Napoleon's army, had forced him to commit his precious guard reserves, had positioned themselves to cut off his retreat when the final collapse came. Plancenoit wasn't a sideshow. It was where the battle was won. The debate over the relative importance of Wellington's Ridge versus Plancenoit continued for decades and became entangled with national pride and politics. British historians emphasised Wellington's genius and British steadiness. Prussian historians emphasised Blücher's determination and Prussian courage. The truth, as is often the case, was more complex than either side wanted to admit. Wellington had held his position through a combination of skill, luck, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to retreat. But he had held it by the thinnest of margins, and without the Prussian attack on Plancenoit drawing off French forces, he almost certainly would have been overwhelmed. Blücher had saved the day by arriving when he did, and fighting as hard as he did. But without Wellington holding the ridge and occupying Napoleon's attention, the Prussians would have faced the entire French army and been crushed. The real lesson of Waterloo, and of Plancenoit specifically, was about coalition warfare. The ability of two allied armies to coordinate their actions, to support each other even when communication was difficult and trust was limited, to fight as a unified force against a common enemy. This was something Napoleon had exploited throughout his career, defeating coalitions by moving between enemy armies and defeating them in detail before they could unite. At Waterloo, the coalition held together. Wellington and Blücher trusted each other enough to risk their armies on the promise of mutual support, and that trust, that coordination, defeated Napoleon more surely than any tactical brilliance or strategic genius. The soldiers who fought at Plancenoit, French and Prussian alike, were pawns in a larger game they barely understood. They fought for causes that made sense to them, for the emperor or the fatherland, for their comrades beside them, for pride or duty, or simply because they were told to and didn't know how to refuse. They showed extraordinary courage in conditions of unimaginable horror, and then they were forgotten, their names lost to history, their sacrifices reduced to casualty statistics in official reports. Only the officers were remembered, and even then, only a few. The thousands of common soldiers who did the actual fighting and dying left no trace except bones in mass graves and entries in regimental rolls. Private Johann Meyer of the 18th Infantry Regiment was 20, 2 years old when he died at Plancenoit. He was the third son of a farmer from Silesia. He had been conscripted into the Landwehr in 1813, had fought at Leipzig, had survived 2 years of campaigning. His letters home, preserved by his family, show a young man who was terrified of battle but did his duty anyway. In his last letter, written on June 17th, the day before Waterloo, he told his mother that he was scared, but that he would make her proud. He died in the second attack on Plancenoit, shot through the chest while climbing over a garden wall. His body was never identified. He was thrown into a mass grave with dozens of others and buried without ceremony. His mother received notification of his death 4 months later. She kept his letters until she died 30 years later. They were found in a trunk in her attic and eventually donated to a museum. They sit now in an archive in Berlin, one voice among millions, a reminder that every casualty statistic represents a person, a life, a family that grieved. Sergeant Pierre Dubois of the 1st Chasseurs of the Old Guard was 38 years old when he died at Plancenoit. He had enlisted in 1796 at age 19 and had spent his entire adult life in the army. He had fought in Italy, in Egypt, in Austria, in Prussia, in Spain, in Russia. He had been wounded 6 times, had been decorated for bravery on 4 occasions, had been promoted from the ranks to sergeant. A rare achievement. He had no family. The army was his family. He died defending the churchyard at Plancenoit, bayoneted by 3 Prussian soldiers who attacked him simultaneously. He killed 2 of them before he fell. His body was identified by his uniform and his decorations, and he was buried with other guard dead in a separate grave. The location of that grave is now unknown. The cemetery where he was buried was later built over. Somewhere under the modern village of Plancenoit, Sergeant Dubois rests with his comrades, forgotten by all except military historians, who occasionally note his name in casualty lists. These 2 men, one Prussian militia, one French professional, never met in life. They may have faced each other in the fighting. They may have been in different parts of the village when each died. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they represent the thousands of ordinary soldiers who fought at Plancenoit, who showed courage under conditions that would test anyone, who did their duty as they understood it, and who died far from home in a battle whose importance they couldn't have comprehended. They were not heroes in the mythic sense. They were just men who found themselves in an impossible situation and did their best to survive and to help their comrades survive. That they died trying doesn't diminish their courage, it emphasizes their humanity. The broader strategic impact of Plancenoit extended well beyond the immediate tactical situation. The battle demonstrated conclusively that Napoleon's system of warfare, the rapid movement and concentration of force that had dominated European battlefields for 2 decades, had reached its limits. At Plancenoit, the emperor couldn't be everywhere at once. He couldn't personally direct the defence while also orchestrating the attacks on Wellington. He had to delegate, to trust subordinates to hold the village while he focused on the main effort. And his subordinates, competent though they were, couldn't match his genius. The defence of Plancenoit was conducted well but not brilliantly. The decision to retake the village with the young guard was sound but not inspired. The final commitment of the old guard was necessary but wasteful. Napoleon's presence might have made a difference in any one of those decisions, but he couldn't be in 2 places at once. This limitation, the inability of one man to control an entire battlefield once armies reached a certain size, would become increasingly apparent as the 19th century progressed. Battles were getting bigger, armies were getting larger, battlefields were spreading over dozens of square miles. The days when a commander could position himself on a central hill and see his entire army were ending. At Waterloo, Napoleon couldn't see Plancenoit from his command post. He had to rely on messengers bringing reports, each report already minutes out of date by the time it reached him. He made decisions based on incomplete information about a situation that was changing faster than he could react to it. This was the future of warfare, and Napoleon, trained in the wars of the 18th century, never fully adapted to it. The Prussians, ironically, had adapted better. Their system of delegating authority to subordinate commanders, of giving them missions and allowing them to determine how to accomplish those missions, worked better in the chaos of large-scale warfare. Bülow at Plancenoit didn't wait for orders from Blücher. He saw the village, understood its importance, and attacked. When that attack failed, he organised another one, and another. He kept attacking until he won, using his initiative and judgment because the Prussian system trusted commanders to do that. Napoleon's system concentrated decision-making at the top. The emperor decided everything, and subordinates executed his orders. This worked brilliantly when Napoleon was present and when battles were small enough for him to control. It failed at Waterloo because the battlefield was too large and the situations too complex for one man to manage. The military lessons of Plancenoit were studied intensively, but the human lessons were largely ignored. The psychological cost of the kind of fighting that occurred in the village, the close-range brutality, the hand-to-hand combat, the burning buildings and trapped wounded, all of it was glossed over in official accounts. Officers wrote of heroism and duty and glory. They didn't write about the nightmares, the guilt, the moral injury of killing at close range, of seeing friends die horribly, of surviving when others didn't. That wasn't considered relevant to military science, but it was relevant to the men who fought there. Many of them carried Plancenoit with them for the rest of their lives, a burden they couldn't share with anyone who hadn't been there, couldn't explain to people who saw war as glorious adventure. In 1865, 50 years after the battle, a reunion was held at Waterloo for veterans of the fighting. Several hundred old men, most in their 70s, travelled from across Europe to visit the battlefield again. They toured the ridge where Wellington had stood, visited Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, the farms that had anchored the British defence. And then some of them, a smaller group, veterans of the Plancenoit fighting, travelled to the village. What they found shocked them. The village had been rebuilt. The church was new, gleaming white stone replacing the burnt ruins. The streets were paved and clean. There was no sign that a battle had been fought there, no indication that thousands had died in these streets. The villagers went about their business, barely acknowledging the old soldiers who walked among them pointing at buildings and trying to remember where they had fought 50 years before. One veteran, a former Prussian lieutenant named Gustav Hartmann, broke down weeping in the churchyard. He had been 23 during the battle, had led his platoon in the final assault that cleared the French from the church. Of the 40 men in his platoon, 11 had survived the battle uninjured. He had carried the guilt of those deaths for 50 years, wondering if better orders, better tactics, better leadership could have saved some of them. Standing in the rebuilt churchyard, he finally found a measure of peace. They had won. The village had been taken. The battle had been won. The war had ended. Europe had known 50 years of relative peace since Waterloo. The boys he had led to their deaths had not died for nothing. Their sacrifice had mattered. It was cold comfort, but it was something. The French veterans at the reunion were fewer. Many had died in the decades since the battle. Others couldn't afford to travel or were too infirm. A handful made the journey, old men in their 70s and 80s, wearing their faded uniforms and their medals. They were treated with respect by the Prussian and British veterans. Former enemies shook hands, shared wine, told stories. At Plancenoit, a French veteran of the Old Guard met a Prussian veteran of the 18th Infantry. They realised they had fought against each other in the churchyard. The Frenchman had been there during the Guard's final stand. The Prussian had been in the assault that overran that position. They sat together in a cafe, these two old men, and tried to remember details of a fight that had lasted minutes 50 years ago, but that had defined their lives. Neither could remember much. The chaos had been too complete. The terror, too, overwhelming. But they remembered the courage they had seen, the friends they had lost, the youth they had left in that burning village. They parted as friends, united by shared experience that transcended national boundaries or old animosities. The memorial to the Prussian dead at Plancenoit was finally completed in 1819. It stands near the church, a simple stone monument listing the regiments that fought there and acknowledging the 6,000 casualties. There is no comparable French memorial. For many years, there was nothing marking French sacrifices at Plancenoit except a small plaque inside the church. The asymmetry is telling. The victors got monuments, the losers got graves and eventually were forgotten. But both sides showed extraordinary courage there. Both sides suffered horribly. Both sides deserve to be remembered. Today, Plancenoit is a quiet suburb of Brussels, absorbed into the urban sprawl of the Belgian capital. The Church of St. Catherine still stands, though it has been modified and updated over the years. Few of the visitors who come to see Waterloo bother to visit Plancenoit. The main battlefield, with its famous monuments and tourist infrastructure, draws the crowds. Plancenoit is a footnote, mentioned briefly in guidebooks, largely ignored by casual visitors. But for those who understand what happened there, who take the time to walk the streets and imagine what they looked like in flames, who stand in the churchyard and think about the men who fought and died there, Plancenoit is as important as any part of the Waterloo battlefield. This is where Prussian Musketeers surprised Napoleon's elite guard, where ordinary soldiers defeated legendary veterans, where courage and determination overcame training and experience, where the impossible happened, again and again, until finally one side could endure no more. The story of Plancenoit is not a story of tactics or strategy, though those elements are present. It is a story of human endurance, of what men can survive and accomplish when pushed to their limits. It is a story of courage, both the celebrated courage of dramatic charges and the quieter courage of simply continuing to fight when every instinct screams to run. It is a story of sacrifice, of men who gave their lives for causes they believed in, or simply for the men beside them. And it is a story of futility, of thousands dying in a few hours for control of a village that had no intrinsic value, that would be forgotten by history, that mattered only because of its position on a map on one specific day. When Prussian musketeers surprised Napoleon's elite guard at Plancenoit, they didn't change the fundamental truths of warfare. They simply illustrated them with blood and fire and courage. And those truths, the lessons written in the bodies of the dead in those narrow streets, remain relevant today. Wars are won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Elite troops can be beaten by determined opponents fighting for something they believe in. And the cost of victory, measured in lives and suffering and psychological scars, is always higher than the winners want to admit.